Alright, I guess the cat's out of the bag. I was going to ask you if you guessed what I was speaking about, but, passion. So yeah, I want to talk to you guys about passion because since I've been little, I've always been passionate about something. When I was 12, I played soccer. I was passionate about that. I wanted to be a professional soccer player, but I was always pretty chubby, so But I want to use two examples. Michael Jordan, I don't know if you guys knew this, but when he was in high school, he got cut from his basketball team. One of the greatest players in NBA basketball got cut from his basketball team, but he had the passion to push through that. Like I said, he became one of the best basketball players that we know. Albert Einstein, he failed math in middle school, and he came out to be one of the best scientists that we've ever known. His passion drove him through that. All right, the person I want to talk about is Jeremiah. I'm not sure how many of you guys know Jeremiah. I was a history major, and when I started out in college, I was a history major. So a lot of times when I look in the Word, I like to go to the Old Testament because it's where all the history is. And so Jeremiah has always been an inspiration to me. And so what I want to start with is the history of Judah and how it came to be split kingdoms. It started out when David came into power, he united all the city-states into one kingdom called Israel. But later on, his grandsons, they were both wicked. They split the nations. The northern kingdom was Israel. The bottom kingdom was Judah. And in 722, Judah fell. Assyria came in. Israel fell. They turned their back on God because everything was good, and so they started turning to false idols, false prophets. And ultimately, God said, "I can't take this anymore." And He sent the Assyrians in, and they overtook Israel, and the kingdom fell. Now, Jeremiah was born in 626 BC. And about that time, people were starting to get threats from Babylon that they were going to take over Judah, the southern nation. And so God sent Jeremiah and gave him a message to say, tell these people to repent. And so he did this. But we find in Jeremiah 1 verse 5, and the presence of God is here.
Good job, Matt.
So we find in Jeremiah 1 verse 5, this is God speaking to Jeremiah. It says, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. There's two things here that I really want to point out. The first, it says, before I formed you in the womb. Now, most of the time when we think of something, it says, before I formed, he put his own hands into it. Some translations say that he knitted us, or he knitted Jeremiah. And I've never knitted before, but when I was young, I was big into model cars. So I took a lot of time painstakingly trying to put those cars together to make it exactly how I want it to be. So God does the same thing with us. He takes us and He forms us in the womb. He knits us. He puts Himself into us. And He forms us exactly how He wants us to be so that He can use us later on in life. All right, the second part, it says, I knew you. I think this is very important because this shows before Jeremiah was even conscious of his own being, God knew him. We're saying God, first of all, God's omniscient, so He knows everything. But the more personal thing is God knows us better than we know ourselves. And so God showed this through Jeremiah. He said, before you were born, I knew you. Later on, it goes to say, and before you were born, I consecrated you. I've appointed you a prophet to all the nations. Now, here, consecrated means to make holy. And so for God to use us, we have to be holy. He has to come in, change our hearts, and He has to make us how He wants us to be. We have to be holy creatures. And says, I appointed you to be a prophet to the nation. So Jeremiah was sent to speak to Judah to try to sway their hearts back to God. On a side note, the first time I speak, I learned why pastors have water on the pulpit. Once you get up here, your mouth goes dry, and it's just crazy. All right, another thing I want to point out here is Jeremiah was only about 20 years old. And so God called him at a very young age. In that society, all the knowledge and all the wisdom was taught by the older people. It was an elder-driven society. And so for someone that young to come and try to spread a message like that, most people probably wouldn't even listen to him. In fact, they made fun of him. And so Jeremiah, being young, like all of us, he tried to make excuses to God. And in 1 verse 6, this microphone. 1 verse 6 said, then I said, alas, Lord God, behold, I do not know you how to speak because I'm a youth. He was trying to say, God, I don't know what to say. I'm a young guy. I'm only 20 years old. I don't know what to tell these people, how I'm going to sway them to come back to you. But God said in verse 7, do not say I'm a youth, because wherever I send you, you shall go. And all that I command you, you shall speak. So God's telling him right there, I'm going to tell you where you need to go. I'm going to give you everything that you need to say. Right. And further on in verse 9, it says, then the Lord stretched out His hand and touched my mouth. And the Lord said to me, behold, I have put my words in your mouth. So He took every excuse that Jeremiah had and just did away with it. He does that with us too. I know when I first got called into the ministry, I really didn't want to do it because I've been told it's a very big responsibility, and I see that now. And so I tried to run from God as much as I could. But ultimately, God just broke me down and was like, look, Mark, you have to do this. This is what I've called you to do. And he took away every excuse I had. I told him I would never be spiritually mature enough to lead a youth group or to lead a church. But God was like, look, I'm going to get you where you need to be. You just need to follow me.
That's right.
And so ultimately, Jeremiah gave in. And because of that, he developed a strong passion for God. In Jeremiah 20, verse 9, it says, which this is one of the most powerful verses I've ever read in my life. It's really influenced me. My email address is Holy Blaze because of what Jeremiah said here. And it says, but if I say I will not remember him, or speak any more in his name, then in my heart it becomes like a burning fire shut up in my bones, and I am weary of holding it in, and I cannot endure it. What he's saying here is he's tried to hold in the word of God. He's tried to keep it to himself, but God's put that passion in his heart so strong that it is physically causing him pain to try to hold it in. It says it becomes a fire in my bones. Now, when we think of fire, we think of destruction, but I think there's something very, very unique about fire. Whenever it starts very small. Like with our passion, if we have a passion, it starts small, but it spreads. And like a fire, like California wildfires, for example, they start in the summer, a leaf catches on fire or something, and it starts small, but then it just spreads tremendously, very quickly. And even trained firefighters have a hard time putting it out. And most of the time, the passion of the fire goes out whenever it's done. And so with us, when God uses us, our passion, it burns strongly. It burns in our bones like a fire. And ultimately, when God is done with that, that's when it burns out. It's not our choice. And so Jeremiah said here, he's weary of holding it in. And so he spoke to the nations. He spoke what God told him to do. And like I said before, they made fun of him. In verse 10 it says, for I have heard the whispering of many, terror on every side. They called him terror on every side. Because he told them, destruction, destruction, destruction. And they were like, well, that's not going to happen. Because they've been listening to false prophets for the last 100 years. And the false prophets were telling them, we're going to be delivered. The same thing is going to happen to us. But God's trying to tell them, you're going to be destroyed unless you turn from what you're doing. And so they started making fun of him and said, terror on every side. And he even goes to say, all my trusted friends, watching for my fall, say, perhaps he will be deceived so that we may prevail against him and take our revenge on him. It says all his trusted friends, even his own friends didn't like him. They hated him because he was saying something contrary to their society, contrary to what they believed. And so they wanted to find any way they could to make him stumble so that they could say, you're lying, and we have these guys over here telling us the truth. They were trying everything they possibly could to make him turn out to be an idiot. They just didn't want to hear it. Their hearts were so hard that they completely turned against God and what he had to say. And that may be because he was young, that may be because he was speaking the truth, but either way, they ignored him. And so Jeremiah was so passionate about God, he didn't let this bother him. He had his message, and the passion grew so strong that he persevered through all the trouble and all the comments and everything. In verses 1, 8 through 9, God tells him that he will protect him. And it says, do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you, declares the Lord. And then verse 19 says, they will fight against you, but they will not overcome you. For I am with you to deliver you, declares the Lord. So he tells them twice in the same chapter. In the very beginning, he says, don't worry about what they're going to do. Don't worry about what they're going to say. I will be there to protect you and to deliver you. And so Jeremiah took this to heart. And I think the problem that we have here is that when we think of stories like this, Jeremiah ultimately got killed. Hebrew says that some were sawn in half. He was sawed in half. And so church tradition teaches that Jeremiah was found in a tree trunk, and his enemies found him and they sawed him in half. But, we think, well, that was a wasted life. He never converted anyone. He was called the weeping prophet, and he eventually died without doing anything about it. But the problem is here, we think too temporally. We think, we may live 100 years. We think, well, God's going to do everything he's going to do from year 1 to 100. But the way God thinks is eternally. God's outside of time. So if he says, I promise to rescue you, I promise to deliver you, that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to do it in this lifetime.
That's right.
And that's a problem that we have today because we feel like, we can get everything at the click of a button. I shop online a lot, so I'm just used to it's right there. I can buy it when I want to. But God more or less says, if you're not going to get it in this lifetime, then I will give it to you the next. He says we're supposed to build up treasures in heaven, not on earth. I like to play video games. I have a few nice things, and that's really, according to God, that's really not as important as the things that I build up in heaven. And that's something that we need to look at. When we go out and do missions or we go and speak to people, God's giving us stuff in heaven that we may not see in this lifetime. And so we have to look forward to those things instead of trying to say, well, I want to get the next video game that comes out. I want to get the next CD. I want to go watch a new movie. Because God is giving us these things that we can use eternally instead of the things that will eventually pass away when the world is destroyed. They're just going to go away. And I want to talk about another thing in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 13 through 16. it says, this is going on with the prophets not getting things in this lifetime. It says, all these died in faith without receiving the promises. So these are the same, just like Jeremiah, there were others of the faith that God had promised them things, but they didn't get it in this lifetime. It says, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance. So these people knew it was going to come. They just didn't know if it was going to come in this lifetime, so they were looking eternally instead of temporally. And it says, at a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. And it says, for those who say such things make it clear they're seeking a country of their own. And indeed, if they have been thinking of that country from which they went out, if they were thinking about their homeland, it says that God would let them go back. But as it is, they desire a better country. That is the heavenly one. So these guys, although God's promised them things, they're looking more forward to the eternal things. They're looking to heaven instead of looking to go back home and go to the place where they were. So it says, therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. So this is a promise right here. He said, God has prepared a place for us when we die. And that's what we should look forward to instead of just the things that we can get now. Because they'll be greater, they're eternal, and they're never going to pass away. You know, we've been talking about a guy from 2,000 years ago, but I want to make it a little more modern. There was a guy, William Borden of Yale. And about 1886, maybe a little bit past that, he was told, William Borden he was the son of the guy that made Borden cheese, the Borden Dairy Company. And his father told him, you can inherit the company, get all the money, all you have to do is go to school. So William Borden he went to Yale, and while he was at Yale, he converted to Christianity. And so he finished school, and he was ready to inherit everything, hundreds of millions of dollars, and instead he decided he was going to give it up. His passion for God was so strong that he bypassed all this money that he could have gotten. Just think what we could do with hundreds of millions of dollars. You know, I could pay off student loans, get a nice house, whatever. But this man decided, I'm going to give all this up because my passion is so strong that I'm going to go out and do missions for God. And his plan was to go to China and to be a missionary strictly to Muslims. But what happened was he was on his way to Egypt so that he could go to China on a plane, and he developed scoliosis. And while he was in Egypt, he passed away. Now, you know, we're thinking, well, he never made it to China, so this man's life was wasted. But the thing about it is, because of his sacrifice, people in the churches on the pews that were thinking about going on missions, they decided if this man could give up all this money, all these things, then why can't I give up the little bit that I have? And so because of this man's death, hundreds of people got off the pews, and they went out to these countries, and they led people to Christ. And I don't know if it would have happened without his death, but the fact is, because of his death, these people went out, and they decided, we're going to give up everything we have so we can go out and minister to these people, and we can witness to these people and bring them to God. So one man's death brought hundreds of thousands of salvations that we may never know about until we get to heaven. And so just because one person can't lead somebody to Christ doesn't mean that he's not going to have an impact on someone else that has an impact on someone else and so forth. It's like passion. It spreads from one to the next, just like a fire. It spreads. And so if, for instance, you know, if this man right here doesn't lead anybody to Christ, he may plant seeds in someone else and it may mature and spread like the fire. All right, I want you guys to bow your heads. Okay. I've talked to you guys a lot about passion. And I want you to think, the top three things that you have, if any of those things are not God, then what's going on? Even the top five. Just think about the passions that you have and try to figure out where God is in this list. And the thing is, as Christians, you know, when we get saved, God gives us that passion to go out and to spread the gospel and to do everything in His name. But somewhere along the way, we tend to lose track of things. We backslide or we just give up. And the thing about it is, all we have to do, if we want that fire back, we just need to ask God. Because God said, if you ask, you will receive.
That's right.
And so we just need to ask God for that passion back. I'm saying some of you may have God as your number one thing, and thank God for that. But others, I know like myself, sometimes we lose track. And God slowly slips down from 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. And we lose track of where we are. And eventually God's just like, look guys, you need to put me back in number one. And so if you guys take time to pray, just talk to God, see where your passions lie, and just try to make God number one.